morning, everybody. I'm Kathleen Carey. I'm Chief Content Officer at ULI in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to welcome you all here. I'm delighted to be able to kick off our first panel discussion this morning on the topic of resilience and the real estate industry. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Jonathan Rose, at the end of the table, is president of the Jonathan Rose Companies, founded in 1989. The company is a multidisciplinary real estate development, planning, and investment firm that's completed more than $1.5 billion of work. The company launched the country's first green transit-oriented acquisition and redevelopment fund, followed by green affordable housing and office transformation funds. Jonathan's book on resilient cities, The Well-Tempered City, is going to be published by HarperCollins next year. And with respect to all of our panelists, I should say that these are very brief introductions, and I refer you to the program. They're quite accomplished, and lengthy bios are in there, so please take a look at those as well. Lynn Thurber, of course, is chairman of ULI and a longtime ULI member and leader. Lynn is chairman of LaSalle Investment Management. She advises the firm's senior management team and heads its global committees on sustainability and risk management for its portfolios worldwide. Hamid Moghadam, to my right, is chairman and chief executive officer of Prologis, the global leader in industrial logistics across 21 countries in the Americas, Europe, and Asia, with over 500 million square feet owned, managed, or under development. Prologis was recently named one of the 100 most sustainable organizations by the World Economic Forum for the 6th year. And Hamid sits on the board of directors of the Urban Land Institute. So let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. Okay, so our panel is resilience and the real estate industry. Let's start off with that. Why should the industry care? Do we care?
Yes.
Okay, well, you know, I'll tell you, I saw some data yesterday, hot off the presses. We're in the midst of collecting data for our Emerging Trends publication that comes out next month. And we asked a new question about resilience, and that question was, are you preparing your portfolios for climate change and the eventualities that that's going to bring? And of the people who said they really do care, this is an important issue for them, only 37% said that they're doing anything about it. So does the industry really care, Jonathan?
So the industry really should care because real estate are fixed long-term assets, and yet they sit in a volatile, changing, dynamic world. And those assets that are become more adaptable are going to do better. So we always think about how we view ourselves as long-term holders, and even if we have funds, they have 7 to 10-year lives. But we also like to build projects that we think will be good for grandchildren. And so if you have that long-term view, and I think when you own real estate, you should have that long-term view, and you can see volatility coming. If you can, the data we saw this morning really indicates the trends. I think as good asset managers, those of us who create more adaptability and resilience in our buildings will have those buildings be more successful in the future.
Hamid, do you think it's really real for the industry? I mean, are people getting it? Are they starting to get it?
You know, I think part of the issue is definitional. I think when you talk to most real estate people and you say resilience, they kind of don't know what you're talking about. But when you talk to them about, do you care about earthquakes? Do you care about flooding? Do you care about all these different aspects? Urban decay, which is another aspect of resilience. I think people care very much about all those things, and they care about it when they invest in properties. They should care about it. I think they do. I know we do. Care about it when they operate properties. You know, just to give you a sense, when Sandy happened, we had 23 buildings that were flooded. But all of those were back up and operating within 48 hours because we had thought about it ahead of time and planned for it and positioned fuel and supplies and all kinds of things. So I think most companies that know what they're doing think about it. They just don't have a resilience department, and they don't think about it in those terms, but they're actually doing things about it. So part of it is definitional. And just picking up on this morning's introduction, I think the majority of our discussion in the next 2 days is going to be around climate change, but I do think there are some really important other dimensions around this topic of resilience, particularly as it applies to San Francisco, that I hope will get talked about.
Lynn, did you want to comment?
I would agree with both what Jonathan and Hamid said, and I think just like sustainability was a new word in our real estate investment vocabulary maybe a decade ago, resilience is just beginning to enter our vocabulary. We certainly have looked at vulnerabilities to things like floods and hurricanes and earthquakes for a long time. And I think it's going to be important for us both to increase our focus on the subject matter as well as to keep it integrated in everything we do, as our speaker just said, because it doesn't make sense that it is a Department of Resilience. It's just part of everything we do to maximize value to our investors in the assets that we own and manage on their behalf.
So can I ask you to talk a little bit more specifically about how you're defining resilience? Hamid, you mentioned that there's not a resilience department, but in a lot of cases there are, I know, I've experienced this, that there is a sustainability group within a company. Is resilience different from sustainability, or should it be something that's just naturally integrated the way sustainability is starting to be? Do you look at them differently?
It depends on who you ask. I think they're related concepts, but they're not the same. I think resilience is a broader concept than sustainability. I think sustainability feeds into resilience because I think of sustainability the way it's been defined in our industry as really what do you do to make sure that your carbon footprint, for example, is minimized over time in the investments that you make in our business. And we spend a lot of time on that. We spend a lot of time on renewable energy, solar generation from our rooftops, lots of things that fall under sustainability. But I think resilience is a somewhat different concept, which is that you're making an investment in a very long-term, infinite life asset, as Jonathan mentioned. And actually, a lot of the vehicles are becoming increasingly long-lived. So it used to be a time where a developer built a building and sold the building afterwards to an institution and didn't really care about what happened to it 10 years into its life. Now there are a lot of entities, many of whom are represented here, that make these investments and own them for 20, 30, 40, maybe forever years. And the way the investors get their liquidity is by selling interest in those companies, the shares. So the company itself has to think very long term. And by definition, if you have a major physical asset exposed to the environment over a very long term, good and bad things can happen to it. And if you're an astute investor, you have to think through those before you commit to it. So I do think resilience incorporates sustainability as one aspect, but I think in its proper form is a much, much broader concept.
Jonathan, how are you thinking about it for your portfolio, your company?
I'm going to answer that in a question, but I'm very tempted. Hamid, you said earlier climate change is one of the factors, but there are others I hope we discuss later. Can you just name what those are? I'd love to know the other factors.
Well, earthquakes, I think, is really important. I mean, we spend a lot of time every time we buy a building in a seismic area. And by the way, everybody thinks seismic means California. Some of the biggest earthquakes in this country have happened in Missouri and Boston. So it's not just the San Francisco thing. It's just that it happens more frequently in California. I mean, we had 2 buildings in Sendai in Japan, right in the middle of the earthquake with the tidal wave. I can show you pictures of these buildings. They had cars inside the building because the wave had brought these cars in and all this mud and all that. So when you're operating on a global scale like we do, you get hit by all kinds of things. So earthquakes, flooding, urban decay. I mean, we own a lot of real estate in very infill areas that were former industrial areas. And urban decay is a real issue. If the neighborhood goes to pots, then the investment that you have is going to be problematic. So you got to worry about that. So there are many, many aspects to this concept. It's all the bad things that are outside your control that can affect your investment during its lifetime, which by definition is a very long period of time.
So I agree with that, and the reason why I wanted to expand that is that the conversation has been so much about climate change, which is important because but remember, one of the phrases we continuously hear is "don't fight the last battle," "don't fight the last," think about the future. So I also include in resilience economic volatility. And so, for example, I did, and also acoustic volatility. So I think we all, those of us who are on the real estate owning side, are trained to continually watch interest rates and to think about when are we going to fix long term, et cetera. So I think we need to take so that, by the way, to me is part of the resilience. And what's interesting, the reason I give that example is that you have floating rates, fixed rates, long term, short term. Those are decisions we always have to be making. And the same thing in real estate. We need to think about its capacities. In some cases, it needs what I'm going to call, it needs to be more robust. So, for example, it might need, on the ground level, different kind of waterproofing or something to be able to resist. And the other cases, it needs, and to me, that's like a fixed rate mortgage too. And in the other case, it needs to be more resilient and it needs to be more flexible. We need to be continually balancing these things. So the first thing we need to do, so what we're doing with our real estate is, number one, looking at the larger climate and environment and trying to figure out what the risks are. And then number two, once you understand those risks, trying to figure out what are the appropriate strategies to solve those. And it may be doing, so it may be doing some things that'll lower our insurance rates. It may be doing things that'll lower our energy consumption. It may be doing things, but a lot of it we've discovered is about preparedness of the staff. So a lot of it is training the on-site staff to understand better what's coming and how to deal with it, and training our residents and occupants in how to prepare better for what's coming ahead.
I'm troubled by this conversation in a way that, and I don't dispute at all this broader definition of resilience, and it's hugely important to how we think about making investments, managing investments, and disposing of investments. But at the same time, we can define resilience incredibly broadly. We can talk about it in terms of urban decay. We can talk about it as the city that depended on buggy whips, and does it really have economic vitality? Is it a livable city? Is it a walkable, bikeable city? And those are all important to resilience in its dictionary definition. But if we do that, we will be a mile wide and less than an inch deep. And I believe there's some benefit to us in this time of climate change and the impact of natural disasters. And I'm willing to take it to all natural disasters, but I think that is a huge enough subject matter in itself, and its impact and what we, the owners of buildings and portfolios, need to do, as well as what the broader community and the government needs to do, that we could fill a month's worth of conversations on that alone. So I think we have an opportunity and perhaps a challenge as ULI and as an industry to figure out how to put enough attention on the resilience factors connected to natural catastrophes and climate change without losing the fact that there are other resilience factors that are integrated into that and important as well.
So I have a solution to that. So let's call that climate resilience. Yeah. And I agree, it's a very important focus. But one of the things that's interesting, remember how many people didn't think about resilience 3 or 4 years ago, and all of a sudden they are. So let's leave the space for one day for people to say, hey, this issue of urban decay or by the way, urban both decrease and increase of rapid, so the world is becoming much more volatile. Things are happening much more rapidly than they happened before. So let's leave the space for there to be other categories of resilience to discuss too. But I agree, we can focus more on climate resilience right now.
Well, let's talk a little bit more specifically. Jonathan, you mentioned a couple of things. Lynn, you and I have had conversations about what you're seeing in your practice, in your own portfolio. What's actually happening? Are there best practices out there that you can share with us, or things directionally where you see your own portfolio headed in terms of risk management assessment, risk management techniques and risk assessment?
I think that that whole subject matter is evolving rapidly, and it's getting more focus and attention. As Jonathan said, for quite some time, there has been a lot of attention to hurricanes in Florida and earthquakes in San Francisco. So certainly, as we enter into due diligence on a property that we're looking at acquiring, there is investigation of both the vulnerability of the property and the structural integrity of the property to mitigate what those risks may be. Interestingly, I would share with you that part of the Global Risk Management Committee that I chair for LaSalle Investment Management, twice a year, reviews scenarios against each one of our client portfolios. And typically, in fact, I shouldn't say typically, should say always, the scenarios that we're playing with are capital market scenarios. They are interest rates, they are looking at debt, they're looking at capital pressures and capital flows. And this past spring, for our semi-annual review in North America, we left it up to our North American team to decide what they wanted to look at. And they said, we'd like to look at the risk impact of natural disasters on our portfolios and our assets. And we had an incredible conversation bringing them all together to first talk about the nature of the catastrophes and how they should think about it. And I will share with you that the number one reaction is, well, can we get insurance, and is our insurance coverage adequate? Yeah. That's number one. Yeah. And many won't go much beyond that. The second part of the exercise was actually having our portfolio managers who managed multifamily assets and office buildings that were affected by Superstorm Sandy come in and talk about their experiences, what they learned, and what they would do differently. And then the third part of the exercise was actually with our asset managers and our property management firms doing what Jonathan said and actually talking about how do you assess the risk, make plans, get prepared, and recover. And there were wonderful conversations that took place about how to improve those processes. You can take them for granted, and we all have short memories, so you worry that 2 or 3 years go by after Superstorm Sandy, and all of a sudden that planning and preparedness, everyone thinks about, why am I doing this twice a year? And I've got more urgent things to do, and then those lists of how to connect with tenants, connect with your vendors, your engineers, your people who are going to help you recover, get lost, get out of date, and when the event occurs, you're not prepared. So it was probably the best received risk management session that we have run, and our European teams and our Asia teams have asked to do the same thing.
That's great. That's great. Hamid, your company, as I mentioned in your introduction, your company is regularly listed and awarded the award as one of the most sustainable companies in the world. So what's going on at Prologis that puts you in that category? And are there specific resilience activities that Prologis takes on that kind of catapults you into the forefront to be the most sustainable organization, one of the most sustainable organizations in the world?
Again, I would draw a distinction between those two things. The reason we spend a lot of time on sustainability, and I remember 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago, I'm getting old, but people were talking about smart buildings, and smart buildings were ones with big risers, and they had fiber optics in them, and that was really a cool thing to do. And 10 years ago, people started talking about sustainable buildings. I don't think 10 years from now, people will talk about sustainable buildings because it will be kind of like plumbing or having the internet in your office. The reason we focus on it is very simple. It reduces operating expenses for our customers. And lest you think that we're doing it for a public service reason, we're not. if we can reduce costs for our customers, more of what they pay goes to us as rent. So we like that, and our shareholders like that. So I look at sustainability as just a smart thing to do to reduce operating expenses or increase the value of your product to your tenant, and you can capture hopefully some of that benefit. So it's a very selfish, shareholder-oriented thing. It happens to be good for the environment, but I think good alone doesn't work. Good alone is not sustainable in sustainability or anything else. It's got to be economically sensible as well. Back to the issue of resilience, which is slightly different. I think we spend a lot of time on it in two instances. One, in underwriting properties and making sure that we at least understand what the issues are. You can't insulate yourself from climate issues anywhere. Because if you draw a map of hurricanes and storms and flooding and earthquakes, I think the only place you can invest in is South Dakota. And there are not a lot of warehouses in South Dakota. So you have to be able to deal with assets that have challenges potentially and be prepared either to mitigate them or to have a plan for deal with them. I think a very important aspect of resilience is customer service and reputational risk for an organization. Because if you have an asset that is affected by climate change, by Sandy, and you can't get to your tenants within a reasonable period of time and meet their needs and get them back up and running, your reputation as an organization is trashed. I can tell you that we were getting calls from our competitors 3 or 4 days after Sandy asking us to go and look at their buildings and help them in the Meadowlands, which was pretty much underwater, because they weren't prepared for it. They never thought about the issue. And it became almost, of course we did it because it's a good thing to do, but it is a real source of competitive advantage. People remember how your organization reacted in a time of difficulty and whether you had the capability to get to your customers and get them back online. And particularly in our business, where we're dealing with warehouses, all the food supply, all the everything that's in this room or any other room comes through a warehouse at some point. You have to be able to get that infrastructure back up, because maybe you don't go to your office building for 5 or 6 days and you can live with that, but you can't not have goods get to people. So when you're in the infrastructure business, you got to get back up on the grid pretty quickly. And that we actually, Sandy and the earthquake in Japan and Sendai ended up being a very good reputation builder for us, because we had thought about these issues and were able to react to them. And there are all kinds of issues that you don't even think about. For example, when the roof gets torn off because the storm comes through, how are you going to get roofers up there? Because everybody at that point is calling all the roofers, and they're the most popular people around. Well, you have to sign them up for those kinds of services ahead of time, and you got to pay them something for reserving that capacity for you, because by the time the problem starts, it's too late to get there. So you got to really, and we're in the good place that we are, unlike Lynn, who has to run a very complicated business and worry about office buildings and shopping centers and everything, we just have to worry about one thing, warehouses. So we can focus on that and really bring our expertise and our relationships to bear on getting our properties back online, because they invariably will get knocked off. So that's a long-winded. When we buy them and when we operate them, that's where we focus.
Great.
There's another benefit to bringing them up and that preparedness factor besides your reputation and your client relationship, and that's with your insurance companies. When your insurance companies see that you, weathered the storm and your property was back online, and that you, in fact, had less damage and less cost.
Absolutely.
Your capability to continue to get the same levels of insurance and work with the insurance companies on the coverage and the cost of insurance is enormously impacted.
Right. Jonathan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so one of the things that we are doing in all of our buildings, that if they are mid-rise or high-rise, is putting in generators for the elevators. Our goal is, particularly in senior housing. We have a lot of senior housing, and particularly low-income senior housing. It's really essential to keep elevators running. In most municipalities, we cannot run the emergency generators on gas. We have to run it on diesel. And in some cases, the diesel even can't be pumped up to the roof. It has to be hand carried to the roof. So there's a limited supply. And what happened in Sandy, and somebody will know the facts better than me, but I think we were down to 2 days of diesel left in the region. And if the timing had been a little different and there had been different damage, we would have run out. Yeah. And so part of the problem is our resilient systems. Cities are interdependent network systems. And so part of the problem is understanding the extent of the network and understanding where so we may have the most perfect generator system, but the diesel truck may not be able to get to us, or it may not be able to get fuel. And so part of it I think we need to do, we as ULI, or we as the real estate industry, is to understand, is to map those vulnerabilities and then have conversations with our cities and regions to understand how they can also help create resilient capacity.
You know, that's a great segue into the next question that I wanted to pose for you, which actually is something that you each mentioned in commenting on what this panel should really be talking about, and that is the respective roles. You know, you can have the most well-prepared and resilient portfolio, but if the community where it's situated is not ready to go, what happens? You know, there's so much risk there. So what is the role of the community in which your assets are located, and what is the role of the public sector in this discussion? Did you want to comment, Hamid?
Well, I think the primary role is to make sure that the infrastructure, the road system, the power system, the grid, and all that is as resilient as possible, because that ultimately, if that gets back online or never goes offline, is what we need. I hate to say this, but I think there is no way that the government can play a role to save all of us when there's a disaster. I think we kind of are on our own somewhat. And certainly, we'd like to be in the top, 1 or 2% of people who can engage in self-help, because they're going to have plenty of problems with other parts of the population to deal with. So, so our attitude is, we got to be self-sufficient on that, and we can't fix the infrastructure problems, but everything else we kind of like to take care of. I want to say a little something about insurance, because Lynn's comment actually resonated with me with respect to people's first solution to this resilience is insurance. I hope there are no insurance companies in the audience, but I got to tell you, we've got all the best policies and yada, yada, yada. I'm not sure the insurance companies are going to be around if there's an 8.2 earthquake in California that is centered around LA or San Francisco, because ultimately, forget about who the insurance companies are, they all end up in the same 3 places, Buffett and Swiss Re and all that. They're the same 4 people holding all the risk globally. So, I'm not sure the ability to pay is really there if something serious happens. So I think if you're just going to rely on insurance to save the day, I don't know. It's something you got to have, but I wouldn't be so sure that it's going to be around when the big one hits.
So I actually participated in a panel several years ago, a private internal panel with the insurance companies about risk. And the chief risk officer said, absolutely, they simply do not have the capacity. When a couple big ones come, they're
wiped out.
They're wiped out.
Especially if 2 happen in 2 different parts of if you get a hurricane in Florida and you get an earthquake in California.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering, yeah. Pretty sobering thought. Hamid, I just have a couple more questions, then I'm going to turn it open it up to the audience for your questions. I'm sure you have a number of them, and I'd encourage you to come up to the mics to raise your questions with this panel. But just a couple more. Hamid, you made reference to events in Japan. I know you have a global portfolio, Lynn, as well, and Jonathan, you have experience around the world as well. Can you talk about, are there lessons to be learned? I think Becky pointed out to us that we are not the Netherlands, but there are some lessons that we've been able to learn from other places. Are we too parochial in terms of thinking that every good idea comes out of the United States, and should we be looking more broadly to come up with some solutions for some of these somewhat intractable problems?
Yeah, I think there are many good ideas that come from everywhere, and we don't have the monopoly on good ideas by any means. I think one thing in Japan that's been really helpful is the densification of their logistic facilities. You know, land is limited, and it's the same size as California, and the population is 4 times as much. So we're forced to build these warehouses that are 8 stories tall, and they're built with seismic isolators. They're built like real office buildings. I mean, they're built with seismic isolators, and they function like well-designed office buildings. So that uses up less land. It's more dense, and has a lower carbon footprint for that reason, and it's easier to get to and fix than a bunch of buildings that are single story and are 1 million square feet. So I think densification is a big lesson we can learn from Japan. But I got to tell you, the most important lesson is the commonality of response in these situations that I saw. The way the teams rally in times of crisis, the way a company culture operates, the way the hat for customer service goes on. And this is not an advertisement. This is all about people. This is not really about the company. But our people performed admirably in these situations. I mean, their own families were at risk. They didn't really know where they were, but they were really focused on taking care of the customers. Some of them slept in the office basically for 3 or 4 days before they could get home, taking care of customers. So I think that was my big takeaway from these disasters, both in Sandy and in Japan, that people really rally around situations like this, and that's a great thing.
That actually reminds me of a wonderful book by a San Francisco writer named Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. And what she describes about is the hell is a series of disasters. She covers 6 or 7 different disasters, and how this incredible community spirit arises, how altruism comes forth, how people spontaneously help each other, and how there seems to be something within the human spirit that place after place, this is what happens. So that's actually a very good thing. I would just also say that ULI as a global organization is maybe the best organization to answer your question, which is what can we learn from around the world. We should really call our district chapters councils from everywhere, and my guess is that every culture has a different solution, and it's useful to learn from them.
Let's start with Lynn. Can you comment a little bit on expanding on Harriet's comment on ULI, and as chair of ULI, what do you think ULI can be doing better, faster, more to be more helpful in this space?
Well, I certainly think that Jonathan's comment about being able to assimilate best practices from around the globe, ideas and the challenges that have been faced and how they've been addressed in other places, because we just learn from each other. You know, I don't know that this is rocket science or finding something new. It's just common sense and best practices. I also think that there's no one better than ULI to convene public sector and private sector together to have those conversations going. And to Harriet's point, when I think about, certainly within my own firm, what we are doing in terms of resilience, it is very focused on the individual building level and then using those best practices across our entire portfolio. But it is not, it interacts with the public sector in the emergency, in knowing what the local municipal planning or local city planning is, in having the right communications with them about evacuations and what their plans are and what's happening with the infrastructure, roads, electricity, et cetera. But it is not at the level of actually working with them on programs to enhance resilience at the community level. Yeah. And I think that is a huge step for the real estate industry to take, and for ULI perhaps to be a convener in that conversation to help take some of these practices and thoughts that we have at the individual level. Now, again, to one of Harriet's comments, I do think that when we underwrite our assets and when we think about the management of those assets over time, using some of the words that you'll hear later today when the Grosvenor publication discussion takes place, we certainly include vulnerability and adaptive capacity of the location, of the city, of the community in how we assess. And resilience is incorporated in that in some way, and will probably have a bigger focus and a bigger role to play going forward. But we're just, as Hamid talked about sustainability, our objective is to preserve and enhance the value of our clients' investments. Mm-hmm. It is return on investment. So we have to figure out how to connect that principle of what our fiduciary responsibility is to our client with this bigger picture of resilience at the community level and how that can either reduce costs or enhance our performance of our portfolio over time.
Yeah. Okay. Can we get another question here?
Is this live? My name is Tim Tosta. I'm a land use and environmental lawyer in the Bay Area. And I unfortunately looked up resilient while we were sitting here, and the Merriam-Webster definition is able to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens. So the point I think I want to begin with is sometimes the choice of words chooses your framework for you. So resiliency is kind of a reactive notion by definition. And sustainability is kind of highly conservative in that we want to keep going something that's successful. I think the kinds of language we have to think about, and what I'm finding in working with the tech industry in building their campuses, and they view the environment and the infrastructure systems entirely different than the real estate industry, because they are looking at putting butts on benches and having people really create value, is to think more in terms of regenerative processes. That is, we have exploited the environment, we have built infrastructure, the infrastructure is decaying, the environment is dilapidated, we don't have the water infrastructure or the road infrastructure. In fact, we don't even have the affordable housing infrastructure in order to retain or maintain a path to the future. So one of the great difficulties here is if we frame ourselves in a reactive or narrow mode, we're never going to get to the thinking that needs to be done, which is, what's this world going to look like 20 to 30 years from now? And are we planning for that timeline? And are we investing in the community through our own behavior, through our investments in public infrastructure and supporting changes in public infrastructure so that there is a sustainable, livable, regenerative place to be? And what I'm fearing about the language in the conversation is if we don't widen the perspective to the overall community environment, to the overall physical environment and the state of its infrastructure, we're just going to have a happy little time protecting the buildings until we can't live here anymore.
So as I understand it, and what I would pose to the panel is, as we, resilience, Lynn, to your point earlier where you were asking people to tell us how long they've been in the space, for many of us is a relatively new thing. Post-Sandy, for many of us, even in this room. Does the language matter that we choose now?
The language matters, but I too looked up that definition and had the same first reaction to it, which is it's your ability to come back after an event. But your ability to come back is about how you planned and prepared for it before it happened. So I don't take it as a defensive or after the fact. I think I don't have a problem with the word resilience. In fact, I think it is very appropriate. Mm-hmm. I do agree with the comment that if we only protect our building and we're not thinking about it at the community level, then we're being very short-sighted. We really have our head in the sand, because you can't totally protect your building without protecting the community.
Jonathan, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I agree that we need to think about regenerative systems, and that we need to think about regenerating both what I call technical systems, or the things that we build, and also natural systems, because they're deeply interrelated.
Do you remember, if you haven't read Rebecca's book, it's really worthy of a read. I think she is extremely left of anybody in this room, so you have to be ready going into the book. But at the end of her book, what she talks about is how communities came together after disaster, and government and private enterprise came up and screwed up what was going on right. It is my best recollection. So there is a lesson in there as well, which is how do we integrate with people trying to react positively after a disaster?
Yep, thank you. Question here, and could I ask you to give us your question?
Sure, I'll be succinct. I'm John Englander, and I do help communities and companies understand sea level rise in particular in terms of both the science, but then how do we think of it differently? And I think the issue just raised by Tim and discussed here about communication and words is really important. And with great respect, even though I think it was Jonathan who said, let's frame this as climate resiliency, and as a way to narrow it, we need to go beyond that. Because while resiliency may suggest the rebound and recovery, we need to think about three things differently. That a storm event or a tsunami or earthquake, we can recover from. It's an area. High tides, as some of those photographs illustrated this morning, are happening more frequently, but we recover from that because the water recedes in hours from a tide or a storm surge in a day or so. Sea level rise is going to raise the impact of both those things and not go down for 1,000 years. The concept of resiliency to sea level rise is totally different than the concept of resiliency to a storm event. And we tend to merge them all together. And if we are to do this, and it's great that ULI is getting into this, I really appreciate the opportunity for the panel tomorrow, et cetera, but that we need to find the right language so that we are truly building the capacity, the designs, the engineering, the planning, to deal with all three of those time frameworks.
So change is coming. What I'm hearing you say, notwithstanding the fact that there may not be an extreme weather event, the sea level is rising. So what are we thinking about that, and are we thinking about that?
Right. So and this has, I use the language endemic and episodic, or maybe it's persistent episodics. Episodic are the things that come and go. And they can be very dramatic. So hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera, are episodic.
Right.
And the endemic or the persistent are the things like, sea level rise, once it's risen for a long, long time. Right. And we actually need to adapt to both of those.
Right. And just as a last comment on that, that when people talk about like sea level rise or even rising tides, which are the harbinger of long-term sea level rise, they quickly go to sustainability and those terms, and they're really unrelated. That's the next level we should start to distinguish, because greenhouse gas reductions, which may have caused the melting of the ice, et cetera, and rising seas in the long term, will not slow sea level rise. And we need to start, that's another level of distinguishing things. Okay, sea levels can rise even if we're all perfectly green starting today. No more greenhouse gas emissions. So just another level of thinking of the language. And I think ULI and the people here, not just in this conference, but in things to come, can help advance that language and that content.
Great, thank you. Roger?
I think that's a very fair point of what the difference is between sea level rise and some of these episodic occurrences that we're talking about. I think one of the things that was one of our first messages out of our After Sandy report was the first thing you have to do in each community is assess what your risks are.
Right.
And they are different, and they have to be addressed differently.
Yep.
There are some commonalities, but there's this starting point, and we wanted to make sure when we created the After Sandy report that it wasn't just about Sandy or the New York area. Mm-hmm. It could then be taken across not only this country but around the globe and have a structure and a language that could be used. And,
right.
And I think that's a quite fundamental starting point is you need to know what your risks are.
Right. Roger?
This is a question for Hamid. When you are thinking about that group of other 100 most sustainable companies in the world, I think very few of which are real estate companies, or if you are, yeah, I was trying to be kind, yes. You are the only real estate company on that list. I'm aware of that. The other, or you're with your friends in Davos talking about this. Who are some of your heroes along the supply chain? Who are some of the people, the companies you think do a really good job? Because this is my only editorial comment. The real estate industry is not so much provincial in terms of America versus other countries. It's often very provincial in terms of not thinking any of this is real until some real estate company is dealing with it. But it turns out that supply chain and the people that are other 100 most sustainable companies think about this a lot. So what are your thoughts on that? Who are your heroes, Hamid?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason, by the way, there are not more real estate companies on that list. I didn't go to Davos to get the award, just in the interest of full disclosure. I got better things to do with my time. But no, I think the reason real estate companies are not represented more broadly is that there is an agency problem in real estate. A lot of the real estate investors, including a portion of our business, are actually running assets for other people. And you get into the issue of who makes the investment and what the time frame for that return is, and whether that investment, it's pretty hard to build the case that if you make an investment in a more sustainable building, whether the tenant captures the benefit immediately or whether the landlord captures the benefit immediately. And once you get into in the long term, you both do. But a lot of the vehicles that invest in real estate are not that long term. And it's very difficult for a fiduciary that's running assets for other people, who doesn't have a balance sheet, by the way, to take money out of their pocket and put it in the building in the hope of getting a long-term return on it. So a lot of people in real estate are running other people's money, so that's why you don't have more people, including, by the way, some of our business, you don't have more people represented on that. One of the companies that I'm familiar with that, I don't know whether they're on the Davos list or not, but I think I really admire, and I was on the board for many years, is Plum Creek Timber. Now, they're a timber company, but they're a sustainable timber company because, and they've been in the certified sustainable timber business for a long time because they've figured out that actually a way of harvesting timber, it's very counterintuitive, but doing it in a sustainable way by thinning timberlands actually increases the biological production, biological timber growth in these timberlands. So you are not deforesting anything. You're taking one tree out of every three, or I don't know what the technical word is, but you're actually increasing the biological production of timber. And they branded sustainable timber, and it became a really good business strategy for them about 10 years ago now, and they got a lot of additional sales as a result of that. So again, I don't know whether most of the companies that are in Davos actually spend a lot of time on their marketing departments more than their sustainability efforts, and actually end up going there because of that. And because of that, we're probably never going to get the 7th award because of that statement. But so I don't know. I'm sure there are lots of sustainable companies in that regard. A lot of our customers have very good sustainability packages. One customer in particular, whose name escapes me at the moment, figured out a way of making corrugated boxes where you get all this e-commerce stuff. E-commerce is exploding. It's a huge thing. The trash that gets generated with all the boxes coming to your home with Amazon things that are 4 or 5 times as big as the stuff that they send you. This company's figured out how to fit the boxes to the stuff that they're shipping you. So they're actually shipping something like 20 to 25% of the volume of cardboard that they were. That's a really smart thing. And I think of that as a very sustainable kind of effort. They're never going to go to Davos because they're not big enough to get on the radar screen. But those are the kinds of things that I really admire, and I see them all the time. Bottom line, and maybe this shows my politics, I think if there's an economic incentive for people to do the right thing, they will. And when that economic incentive doesn't exist, no amount of legislation or anything is going to force them to do it. So I think if we work on the right incentives, and impact on the environment is a real cost, is that most of the people producing it don't pay it. And that's why people don't pay attention to it. If we can close that loop somehow, and I'm not necessarily talking about a carbon tax or anything, there are lots of ways of closing that loop. I think people will do the right thing because the economic signals will be there for them to do the right thing.
Great, thank you. Another question here?
Yes, Greg Lowe from the Willis Group. I just wanted to comment on Hamid's, I guess, statement around the insurance industry, since I'm one of probably the very few people in the room from the insurance industry. And I'm speaking about some of this later on today, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. But I think, the question of can the industry withhold multiple clustering events is, we have a lot of confidence that it can. How it will actually affect businesses and pricing, I think, is a different question. But the insurance industry, about 20 years ago, following Hurricane Andrew, was in a disastrous state. And what followed Andrew was a combination of leading-edge science, changes in capital and policy, and what was decided is, what should the tolerance of an insurance contract be? And it was agreed that 1 in 200 year event was kind of what in an insurance contract needed to withhold. And we're trying to think about how this question can actually be applied to business. I think a lot of businesses need to be asking themselves the same questions. What is your 1 in 100 year maximum probable loss from a variety of natural hazards? I think if real estate investors and actually companies across the economy started asking these questions, there'd be a lot of economic incentives to address some of the topics around resilience. And I'd be curious to get the thoughts from the panel on have those questions been asked, and if they were asked and made public, what would the reaction be? Would there be any change in decisions and behavior?
Can I say something about that? I think people are very bad at estimating the kinds of things that are 1 in 100 year flood, or, I mean, we've had about 15 1 in 100 year floods in the last 20 years. So I think people are notoriously bad in assessing those kinds of probabilities. People described as the recent financial meltdown in 2008 as a 1 in a career kind of event. But the RTC in 1990 and before that, the housing crisis that nobody remembers anymore, which was almost as big as this one we just had in 1980, where it seems like these kinds of things happen a lot more frequently than most people think. And certainly in the area of climate, given the underlying long-term trends that are in place, I think a lot of the probabilities that were generated based on looking at history are not really as reliable indications of what's going to happen in the future. So I don't want to be argumentative about this. I just don't think we're particularly good at estimating those kinds of probabilities, and therefore a lot of the models that are built on those kinds of probabilities are probably going to undercover us. Or at least that's my working assumption, and if I get surprised about being wrong about that, then it's okay.
I don't dispute that, but at the same time, I would say just because we're not terrific at it today doesn't mean we're not trying and that we should stop trying to assess it. So I certainly think that whether it is Hamid's company that from the shareholder basis has exposure to the whole portfolio, which is a little bit different than our portfolio where it's different investors, we think a lot about aggregate exposure in one marketplace. So even if we, and did, get comfortable with acquiring multifamily in Hoboken, New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy, we're not going to make that 80% of our portfolio. And so I think it has a lot to do with how much exposure, and which is exactly what's happened to the insurance companies. I could go back probably 20 years at LaSalle, and we had one insurance company covering our whole portfolio. We now have 11 insurance companies just on our first layer of coverage, and we have 60 companies in total when you look at the entire coverage of our it's probably a $10 billion portfolio today in the U.S.
Jonathan, do we have the tools we need to assess the risk? Is that where we really ought to be thinking about making some dramatic improvements?
Well, I think we need to think about lots of things, but that is definitely one of them, and I deeply believe we do not have the tools. Am I understanding? So I guess my question to you is, does the insurance company system have a different definition of 100, 200, and 500-year flood than FEMA? Because the FEMA ones clearly, you know, when we know places that have like had 3 500-year floods in recent history, so they're wrong. So do you trust those, or do you use something else?
I mean, insurance models are based off usually a variety of internal modeling from vendors. I know there's someone from RMS joining me on the panel later today. They probably have a lot more expertise in modeling specifically. I mean, the issue of climate change and being integrated into models is certainly, I think, as Hamid noted, a challenge for us. You know, contracts are renewed on an annual basis usually, so you know, there is the question: how do we get into the state of predictive modeling? You know, do we actually, you know, project forward what the climate's going to be like in, you know, 100 years' time? So I think there is a lot of emerging discussion around that. I don't think we're quite there yet.
But just, I'm sorry, just really simply, when you said we make a 200-year decision, you know, we look at the 200-year risk. So are you taking FEMA's 200 years, or do you have a different 200 years risk system you're using?
Each insurance company is probably going to use their own methodology, which is usually proprietary.
Okay. We have one question here.
Yeah. I don't know. Oh.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could comment on any tendencies to obfuscate the risk information that's available to the public, and like fuzzy flood maps, you can't tell what street it is, that sort of thing, and maybe what's going to happen as those fuzzy lines on those maps start to get clearer and clearer, and you know how the industry would use it, and just sort of in general the idea of the fact that a lot of times people don't really want to know, or they don't want the public to know, or that sort of thing.
So as our tools and models get better, how will the industry use it?
It's a good thought. I'll look into it, but I didn't really think of it as a conscious decision to make the issue less clear. But maybe you got something there. I don't know. I got to think about it.
It sounds like the part of America where every kid gets an award, whether the team wins or loses, and so I actually think the more direct communication of serious risk to homeowners and business owners is very important. And I think you're right, in some communities that communication is being muddled.
We certainly found that in our after Sandy discussions, where prior to the storm hitting, not only did the maps change afterwards, but people really didn't know what the mapping was. It was very unclear. I think now transparency and communication, people understand that is expected of them. I think the greater complexity to me is that the knowledge keeps changing, and therefore the models and the mapping keeps changing. So the latest FEMA maps are showing this 100-year floodplain, whether you believe it's 1 in 100 years or not, has moved inland quite a bit. We certainly see the insurance companies have changed the definition of Tier 1 and have expanded that all up the eastern seaboard, no longer stops at the North Carolina border, and the Tier 1 has also gone farther inland for wind and flood, which means we're capturing more in our portfolio for Tier 1 pricing and deductibles.
Okay, so thanks, Lynn. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more quick questions. Bill, quick question?
Yes, Bill Ashbrook. And I do want to just thank Greg for the shameless self-promotion regarding being on a panel later today. It's bordering on self-promotion to ULI, which we know we don't do. I'm moderating that panel, so please come. A real kind of a question that came up Hamid, listening to you, Jonathan, and Lynn. One of the things that's a real challenge, we're here convened, and we talked about this, ULI is the right place, but we all have disparate interests because we all participate in the industry differently, and some of us are actually in supportive disciplines. You know, we're in design. You know, when you take the issue of energy efficiency and sustainability, the portions of, that support our industry that came to light with all these different, solutions they had them for years. We just never thought to imply them. So a question would be, what is it that we need to do? And maybe it's not around the word resiliency. Maybe it's a new word we have to come up with in the next day and a half. What do we do to get all the disparate interests that are around to be able to give people a common vesting to be able to move forward? And I include even when Becky was talking about what do we do with roads? What do we do with infrastructure? What do we do with grids? So I'm tossing this out to you. How do we pull this together? It's a great last question.
Okay, panel, any, let's talk about Bill's question, but also any final thoughts, because we are going to have to move our conference along. So who'd like to respond to Bill's question and then give us your final thoughts on this topic?
I will throw out something that we haven't talked about as an area of exploration. I think behavioral economics has a lot to do with everything that we've just talked about. I think people's willingness and ability to plan for or pay for events that are small probability events. The human mind does funny things. I mean, the day after 1989, everybody went and fortified their soft story basements in San Francisco, in the marina, right? And 10 years later, people don't think about earthquakes being a real thing. And then Napa happens, and that sensitivity goes on for another 3 months. I just think that it's worthwhile thinking about, ultimately, individual behavior affects public policy and all that. And I think it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time thinking about how people make those economic decisions and how the human mind actually works in assessing these kinds of risks. And I'd like to see a panel on that next time you do one.
Well, I think we're going to have one. Jonathan?
So our panel has a whole section on the resilient mind. So
okay, good.
But Hamid is absolutely right that behavioral economics, and that was what I was trying to imply earlier, is that some of this is about hard systems, some of it is about large-scale urban or regional systems, some is about what we can do in our individual buildings, and a lot of it is about behavior at all these levels.
Lynn, the last word?
I look forward to the next day and a half. I think this is a wonderful conversation. To Bill's point, I think the fact that we have people who are coming at this from so many different angles makes this conversation so much richer. It will be chaos for a while, but eventually I think we will find that we find frameworks for holding the conversation, and I look forward to that.
Well, what a great way and a great panel to kick off our conference. I want to extend our thanks to these wonderful panelists, and thank you all.